and we'll be looking at a part of one of those verses in that chapter in just a moment. One of my closest friends is from Mumbai, India, and he explained to me the caste system in India, that you got the priests and the warriors, and then there's the third people below all of them, and this culture that has got a very clear way of looking at those who are important in society and then those that are not as important. And my friend told me that in his time living in Mumbai, he has seen the caste system erode. He's seen it not have the kind of power that it used to have, although it obviously still exists. And we had discussions about what it was that subverted the caste system as he saw it. And in the conversations that we've had about that particular topic, he explained that it's the ethics of Christianity and the things that Jesus modeled and Jesus commanded and Paul would write about that would cause people from different groups in a caste system, from one higher caste to a lower caste, spend time with each other and worship together and even marry each other at times. What is it about Jesus in the gospel that would cause a society to have that kind of a shift and that kind of a change? We're looking at a series in Romans chapter 12 where we're talking about becoming a living sacrifice. And the challenge in these lessons is that we're going to take our time, our talents, and our treasures, and we're going to sacrifice them for the Lord. That we're not going to do everything just because I'm the center of everything. I'm not going to use people for myself. I'm not going to use my time for myself exclusively. I'm not going to use my talents or my resources for myself exclusively. But I'm supposed to be a living sacrifice, which means that while I live, I'm putting things to death in my life. I'm allowing things that I have to be sacrificed for the good of others, for the sake of Jesus' kingdom. And this series of lessons comes from Romans 12, 1 and 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. The rest of this chapter, at least in the book of Romans, gives you different instructions on how to be a living sacrifice. But the way that this is going to happen in our life is we have to have renewed minds. One of the hopes that I have for this series, as we've been looking at this about once a month, is that we've been learning to think differently about the things that I have, the things that we want to have, the time that we have. And we're thinking more in terms of how I can be a steward of these things for the betterment of others. The outline of what we've been looking at, and there's a few of you that noticed that I didn't preach a lesson in this series last month. We're doing this basically every month. But in September, we looked at rejoicing and weeping with one another, and it was just so connected to living in harmony with one another in verse 16 that I just combined that into one lesson. And so this was going to be a 12-part series, but it's now going to be an 11-part series. But we're looking at this one here in November about not being haughty. And with every one of these instructions that we've looked at, there's been some new way of having to think about these things, some new enlightened way, some new renewed way of thinking about my gifts, about the way that I should love other people, the things that I should hate, like the things that are evil. The fact that all of us in this room are brothers in Christ, that we're supposed to treat each other like a real family, and there's all kinds of implications that we looked at from that. But what we're looking at in this lesson today is do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. And if this instruction is lived out by people that genuinely and sincerely live it out, this is the kind of thing that changes cultures like in India. This is the kind of thing that changes the world. This is the kind of thing that changes towns and changes churches and changes families. There's a lot of power in this if we'll take this seriously. Let's go ahead and read Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 16. And then we're going to zero in on the second part of verse 16. Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 16. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. You can see in this verse, in verse 16, that there's two do not commandments. There's two things that we're not supposed to do, and there's one thing that we're supposed to proactively do. And I like the way that the New American Standard puts this. The New American Standard says, do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. The first thing I want us to think about as we look at this part of this verse is, first of all, the problem of pride, the do not instructions. Do not be haughty, do not be wise in your own estimation. And then the second part of the lesson, we'll talk about associating with the lowly, because that's the path in this text on becoming somebody who's humble. But start out with the first two do not instructions. Do not be haughty in mind. What does that mean to be haughty? The Greek word that's used here, something like hypsilos or hypsilos, something like that, means something along the lines of high, lofty, exalted. It's this idea of putting yourself on a pedestal, the idea of thinking that you're something great. Jesus would use and refer to this word in another context, the same Greek word, although it gets translated differently in English. But he says in Luke 16, verse 15, for what is exalted, or what is haughty, lifted up among men, is an abomination in the sight of God. Do you believe that that's true, by the way? That the things just generally that people think, oh, that's amazing, and that's great, and this is awesome. The things that generally humanity finds to be exalted and great is oftentimes in the eyes of God something that's an abomination. And you start to look at the things that we esteem, the things that we want to group up around and be associated with because that's what the world esteems. Do you see how much of a problem this idea is of lifting yourself up and trying to associate with things that you think are lifted up so that you can share in some of that exaltation? Do not be haughty in mind. Okay, well, so that's the idea of haughtiness. What about the idea of being wise in your own estimation or wise in your own sight? This is one way that we would exalt ourselves, so you can see how these things are connected. But to be wise in your own sight means that you think you've arrived at some degree of wisdom and sophistication and maturity, that you would say things like, well, yeah, most of the time I am right. And everybody else is the one that's always wrong, and I'm the one that's got things figured out, and everybody else is usually the problem, and everybody else is the one that can't see things, and it's always me that can see all the things. And so the person that's wise in their own sight, consequently, won't be somebody that ever seeks for advice. Or let me say it this way, because our hearts can trick us. If you ever do seek for advice, it's under the pretense that you're a humble person, but you're never going to actually take the advice that's given you. You ever done that before? Hey, well, you know, I think this is one of those things that humble people say, what do you think about this? Okay, interesting. But in your heart, you have no desire to actually do the good advice that you're listening to. That's being wise in your own sight. Well, there's a couple proverbs that say some pretty shocking things about people who are wise in their own sight. Proverbs 3, verse 7, be not wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. Let's say that in my human relationships, I never listen to anybody else's advice, I never seek out anybody else's advice, and therefore my heart is in such a condition that I don't think I need anybody's input from outside of me. And you trace that out to its logical conclusion, and you will think that same thing about God. The person who's wise in their own eyes is not just wise in their own eyes before other people, and I don't need to ever get anybody's help for anything. But that attitude gets extended out to how they view God. Oh, yeah, I'll go to that Bible study, but I'm not going to change. Oh, yeah, I'll go to that Bible study, but I'll apply it to everybody else around me because I think I'm pretty good. If you're wise in your own eyes, this text says that you're living in evil that you need to turn away from. That's scary. But look at this one. Proverbs 26, verse 12. Do you see a man who is wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. I like how Solomon, as he writes this book to his children, it's like, all right, you imagine Solomon talking to his children, like, hey, did you see that car accident over there? Do you see how, like, you need be careful that you don't do that sort of thing? You know how parents will train their kids in things like that? Well, Solomon's like coming to his kid and be like, hey, do you see that person over there that's really wise in their own sight? Do you see that? Yeah. He does seem to have a pretty high opinion of his own opinions and so on and so forth. And then Solomon says to his kid, there's more hope for a fool than that guy. By the way, in the book of Proverbs, is there a lot of hope for the fool? No, there's not. The fool can maybe at least harm himself enough to a point where he does reach rock bottom and actually change. But the person who's wise in their own estimation is going to keep digging their heels in over and over and over again until they bury themselves. More hope for a fool than for that person. All these different ways of exalting yourself, thinking that you've got more than other people. And maybe you do, but it's getting to your head in such a way that you really do think that you're superior. All right, that's the concept that Paul is saying in this text. Do not do these things. Stop doing these things. Okay, let me tease out, though, a couple implications from the person that's haughty or from the person who is wise in their own sight. Think about the imagery of being exalted and lifting yourself up. There's a couple implications, and maybe this is going to be something that might help you diagnose yourself. Am I somebody that does have this problem of pride in my heart? So keep that imagery of being exalted in your mind. That's the word picture or the image of somebody who's prideful. Well, what would be some implications of this loftiness that somebody's putting themselves into? First of all, haughty people are competitive. It's not just that I want to be lifted up. It's always going to be in relation to being lifted up above other people. And so by nature, people that are prideful, people that are haughty, people that are wise in their own eyes, it's not ever in a vacuum. It's always in comparison to other people. And so therefore, you're competitive. I like what C.S. Lewis says on this point in his book, Mere Christianity. He says, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more than the next man. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good-looking, but they are not. They are proud of being richer or cleverer or better-looking than others. If everyone else became equally rich or clever or good-looking, there would be nothing to be proud about. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition has gone, pride has gone. Pride is essentially competitive in a way that other vices are not. Do you find that to be true in your life? You can even think about different skyscrapers that used to be the tallest building in the world. And I don't even know what used to be the tallest building in the world. Right now, it's the Burj Khalifa, I think, somewhere in the Middle East. That's just giant. And whenever the newest, highest building is made, we forget about the other ones that used to be the tallest ones. Because now this is the most exalted compared to all the other ones. Now, if you're somebody who's always referencing yourself to how much you have, the influence that you have, the status that you have, the wealth that you have, the beauty that you have, the strength that you have, the wisdom that you have, it's always in reference to having more than other people. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 4 says this. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work came from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and striving after the wind. Do you suppose that there's been some really creative, successful people in this world that have amassed a lot of wealth for themselves, that have really honed their talents and all these kinds of things? And really what was motivating it all along was just envy. Yes, that's what Ecclesiastes is saying here. And so if you're somebody who's lifted up in your mind, and you're somebody that is wise in your own sight, do you know what else is going to accompany you because of your competitiveness? Is constant friction among people. It's going to be hard for you to have any close friendships. It's going to be hard for you to be around people that you think have more than you. I'll say more about that in just a moment. You're just going to be somebody that because of your competitive nature, you won't make friends that are going to stick around you for very long because they're going to see right through it, and they're going to see that that you're all about just having more and more and more, and you're just focused on those kinds of things. So, a prideful person by nature, a haughty person, is competitive. But notice the second implication. The haughty is emotionally unhealthy. Well, why do I say that? Just start with if you've ever had a physical problem with your body. Like I had an ingrown toenail not too long ago. I also said something in the sermon about it. Some of you gave me some good advice about that, so thank you for that. When I had the ingrown toe, do you know how much I was talking about my toe? I was talking about it a lot. Like I said, brought it up in a sermon. During that time, do you know what I didn't ever talk about? Is how well my elbows have been working. And my kneecaps are doing what, my kneecaps have always done. I'm really proud of my kneecaps right now. My elbow is just, man, it's just like so perfect, my elbow. You bring attention to things that have some kind of unhealthy aspect to it. You do that with your body. So how about this? How about that in so many conversations, you're always having to tell people the successes that you've had, the good things that you think you should get credit for, all the work that you've put into everything. Why do you keep bringing up those things? It's because there's something emotionally unhealthy about you. You're looking for some kind of affirmation. You're looking to impress people with some kind of thing. And I'm not saying that in close relationships it's fine to talk about some of these kinds of things. But the point is if you're constantly bringing these sorts of things up, it's because there's some kind of insecurity in you where you need to get praise from people like your next hit of a drug addiction. So that in your mind, it's confirmed to you, yes, I am something great. Did you see the way that they were impressed when I talked about all the things that I have and all the things that I've done? You're emotionally unhealthy if you're constantly bringing attention to your successes and the things that you think are great about you. Thirdly, though, the haughty are always going to be unsatisfied. Because if by nature pride is a competitive thing and I'm always comparing myself to what other people have, you might feel really good if you live in Bowling Green, a city that's not that big, but in Bowling Green, I might be one of the richest people, or I might have one of the coolest houses, or I might have one of the nicest cars in this city. Whoopee-doo, good for you. How about you go to San Diego, California? With everything you got and take it to San Diego, California. You're going to be pretty impressive there? Probably not. The point being that if you really stop and think about it, you're always going to have other people that have more than you. And when you're around people that have less than you really like that because you get to talk down to them and you get to talk about your life experience and you get to talk about the things you've learned in life and all this sort of thing. And as soon as you're around somebody that you perceive to have more than you do not like it. And so, you have this drive to always get more and more and more because you know that there's people that have more than you. Madonna articulated this well, the singer, whatever she is. In an interview, Madonna said this: "My drive in life comes from a fear of being mediocre. This is always pushing me. I push past one spell of it and discover myself as a special human being, but then I feel I am mediocre and uninteresting unless I do something else. Because even though I have become somebody, I still have to prove that I am somebody. My struggle has never ended, and I guess it never will." Here's somebody that has accomplished a lot of things, really popular musician, whatever. And I'm always afraid of being mediocre. I'm always afraid of losing the things that I think have made me what I am. You get that? One of the odd things about the sin of pride is that, like every other sin, gives you some kind of momentary pleasure. What is the momentary pleasure of envy and pride? Maybe it's when you're around people that you think you're better than, and then you get this like high from it or something like that. But most of the time, you're just left unsatisfied. Notice the fourth implication, though, from this imagery of being lifted up, is that the haughty are vulnerable. The reason that I say that, again, if you start with the physical picture, whenever you go in an airplane, they always have that thing that nobody pays attention to where the steward person gets up and this is how you do the seatbelt, and in case of a water emergency, put this thing on and go, and then you blow into the thing to puff it up. That's like when everybody's looking at their phone, that's the last couple minutes before they have to put it on airplane mode, so everybody's doing all that kind of thing. Nobody pays attention. The idea, though, is that if you're going to be up in lofty heights in a plane, you've got to be real careful. Maybe a month and a half ago, Abigail and I went to Birmingham, Alabama, for a gospel meeting. And there was one day when I got to do some sightseeing with Abigail. And I took her to a place called Vulcan Park, which is the world's largest cast iron statue. And we got to go up into this giant tower, and the statue is on top of this tower. We got into this elevator and we went up there. And when we were walking around on this platform, the gate around it was super high because they don't want anybody to jump off of it. Because they know that if you're lifted up and high on something literally, there's a greater vulnerability to becoming injured if you were to fall. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18 says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." You want to know why you're vulnerable if you're a prideful, competitive person? Is because every time you lift yourself up and you talk about this thing that I did and that wisdom that I have and these things that I think I deserve, somebody's going to cut you down. You're not going to get that promotion at work that you thought that you deserved, and everybody's going to wonder, well, that guy talked or that girl talked all about how great they are, and then they didn't get all those things that we thought, well, that's very shameful, very humiliating. When you lift yourself up and then you can't deliver and you don't deliver, or circumstances allow you to not deliver, you fall and everybody sees it and they go, I guess you're not as great as you thought you were. You see how vulnerable you're making yourself? All right, so those are some ways to maybe diagnose and to think about this in my own life. Do I have this problem? But what is the path to humility then? And this idea by itself could cover several sermons. But because we're looking at Romans chapter 12, verse 16, I want to just bring up the one thing that this verse says. And the one thing that this verse says in this context is to associate with the lowly. Well, what does that mean, to associate with the lowly? Well, whatever it means, if I were to do this, this would help me not be prideful. And this would help me not be wise in my own estimation. So there's actually a debate about what Paul means when he talks about associating with the lowly. There's two things that he could mean, and he might mean both of them. Look at this quote from Grant Osborne. The central admonition here is the importance of associating with the lowly. And he gets into some Greek technical stuff, but it's to get to a point. Lowly could be neuter, lowly things, as well as masculine, lowly people. The latter is best in this context, but Paul could well be referring to both. The idea being, so he doesn't say associate with lowly people, he says associate with the lowly. So is he talking about associating with lowly people, or is he talking about associating with lowly things? Well, how about both of them? And let's just make those 2 points here. What would it mean to associate with lowly things? The idea that you don't always need to have really nice things. You don't need to have everything be luxury. But maybe we could even start with this. Do you associate yourself, the way you talk about yourself, in a lowly kind of way? And we've already talked about this some already, but this is one of the applications we got to consider. How do you talk about yourself to other people? Are you always saying high and exalted things? Proverbs chapter 30, verse 32, if you have been foolish, exalting yourself, or if you've been devising evil, put your hand on your mouth. The next time you're tempted to tell somebody this great thing that I've done, this just says, quit it, stop it. Instead, later, what Proverbs 27 verse 2 says, let another praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips. If you are to receive praise, have it not come from yourself, but from other people. But don't be the one that tries to instigate it. Don't be the one that tries to walk around telling everybody how great you are. Do you associate yourself with lowly things? I'm not saying that you got to be self-loathing constantly, but how do you talk about yourself? And maybe that's one application. But maybe lowly things could be applied in a materialistic way. Are you the kind of person that always needs to have name brand things? Are you the kind of person that always needs to have everything be luxury? Are you the kind of person that every time you go out to a restaurant, it's got to be like 5-star kind of stuff? And I'm not saying it's wrong to enjoy that sort of thing from time to time, but if you're the kind of person that just needs to be pampered with nice things all the time, do you suppose that that does something about your mindset about those who don't have those kinds of things? My clothes have always got to be pristine. Everything that I have, everything in my house, everything's got to be... How about this as a scenario? Imagine that you were going to fly to another city, and you were going to get a rental car, and you signed up for some kind of luxury rental car. And then when you get there, they say, I'm sorry, we're all out of that. All we have, and I'm sorry if you drive one of these, I don't mean it in a negative way towards you. I'm sorry, but all we have are Kias. The newer Kias are actually pretty cool, but like when I was younger, Kias were like the cheap cars. So imagine that you were expecting like a Cadillac, and then you had to drive a Kia. What would your attitude about that be? Have you ever had a scenario like that, by the way? Do not be haughty, associate with the lowly. Lowly things that you might think that you're above, that you shouldn't think that you're above. All right, so that's one application of this. Associate with lowly things. But what about associating with lowly people? And maybe this is more to the point, but I think both of them would apply here. Associating with lowly people. In this culture, the Roman culture, people were always trying to associate with people that were important. The position that you ate at a dinner, for example, was a really important thing. If I sat closer to the host, that was a big deal. If I can associate with these politicians, that means I'm something. This is sort of like the problem of the Corinthians. I'm of Paulus, I'm of Cephas, I'm of whatever these different factions were. If I can group up around people that I think are really great, then I can share in some of that greatness with them. How are you doing with associating with the lowly? Jesus would use illustrations like taking a baby that's probably drooling and making funny sounds and says, true greatness in the kingdom is receiving something like this. But you guys are all about networking. And you guys are all about hanging out with those that are really important that can do something for you. Leo Tolstoy was a very famous Russian author, wrote a lot of books that were very, very popular. Even in his own day, he was popular. And he wrote some other books that are not as well known, that are religious in nature. He wrote a book called The Confessions. In The Confessions, he's talking about his path to becoming an unbeliever in God to a believer in God. I don't know what he believed about how to be saved, none of that kind of thing, but I know that he got to a point where he believed that God and the Bible were ridiculous, and then he got to a point where he thought it was plausible, and he believed in it in some capacity. And in his book on the Confessions, he talks about how he's part of these elite people of society and the work that he was associating with really high people. Look what he says about these people he associated with. The view of life these people, my comrades in authorship, consisted in this: that life in general goes on developing, and in this development, men of thought have the chief part, and among men of thought, it is we, artists and poets, who have the greatest influence. Our vocation is to teach mankind. All right, so here is Leo Tolstoy. He's hanging around really important people, and he says, our job is to instruct. It is to teach mankind. Does that sound like some pretty important people? And as he writes about his time that he spent with some of these people, look what he says here. By the way, he explains in this book that these people looked at themselves as priests in this grand religion of secularism that we had to teach everybody. So they were like the new priests. So he uses that imagery here. I became convinced that almost all the priests of that religion, the writers, were immoral and for the most part men of bad, worthless character, much inferior to those whom I had met in my former dissipated and military life. But they were self-confident and self-satisfied, as only those can be who are quite holy or who do not know what holiness is. These people revolted me. I became revolting to myself. All right. Who are the kind of people you follow on social media? Are you always wanting to know the latest about every person that is elite in our society, these priests of our society that are supposed to instruct us through their music and through their movies? You really look up to people like this. And then you've got Leo Tolstoy who's hanging out with people like this, and he says, these people are disgusting. These people have got no character. These people that you might want to be around, they're not the lowly of society, they're the esteemed of society, which drove him to go spend time with poor farmers. Look what he says about this. I began to draw near to the believers among the poor, simple, unlettered folk, pilgrims, monks, sectarians, and peasants, and I learned to love these people. The more I came to know their life, the life of those who are living and of others who are dead, of whom I read and heard, the more I loved them, and the easier it became for me to live. It came about that the life of our circle, the rich and learned, not merely became distasteful to me, but lost all meaning in my eyes. You want to know sometimes, like one of the struggles that we sometimes have as Christians? We watch a football game and we go, do you know that such and such player is actually a Christian? We think about some famous musician like Weird Al Yankovic, who actually is a Christian. And you know, like I know people that he's served the Lord's Supper to. Well, that just makes Christianity all the more cool. That we've got such great people. Look at these people that who are the Christians you've learned the most from? Who are the Christians that have most impacted you? Is it the people that everybody knows? Is it the people that are boasting about all the things that they have and want you to know how great they are? Or is it the people that quietly disseminate information, good knowledge, they genuinely love people, and perhaps because of some of those things, they're not very well known? Leo Tolstoy says that when I hung around these losers of society is when I finally learned how to enjoy living. What do you esteem? What kind of people are you impressed with? Are you impressed with people that talk about how much they have? That's a sign of shallowness. It's a sign of spiritual immaturity to constantly be impressed with things like that. My summer between my junior and my senior year of college, I preached full-time for a church of 8 people, maybe 10 people. And it was largely made up of one family with the matriarch of the family. And most of them had mental problems. And leading up to that summer, Samantha had kept praying that God would add more people to this church so we could get more synergy going, so we could do more evangelism in the town. And Samantha finally decided that she was just going to live there that summer too, with those 7 women in a trailer. 7 people, largely with mental problems, living in a trailer. Samantha shared a bedroom with an 80-year-old matriarch. Do you suppose that Samantha would have learned and gained more from a summer like that than she would spending time with all the important people of society that you want to network with and rub shoulders with? This is what real living is like. People who love God, people who want to serve Him. Are you associating with lowly people? You could apply this in the local church. Maybe there's people that you perceive to be lowly in some way. You better not be haughty about that. But if your perception is that, well, that person's kind of lowly. Well, are you ever spending time with that person? You ever associate with that person? Or what about some of your neighbors in your neighborhood? Maybe people that don't really comb their hair very well. They wear that same jacket every time you see them, whatever. And you say, they just seem kind of lowly. Look at that old car that they drive. It's got rust all over. It makes a loud sound. It sounds like a big mosquito. Like, okay, well, maybe they're lowly people. And the only thing that would prevent you from associating with such people is your own pride. One of my favorite hymns is "There's Not a Friend Like the Lowly Jesus." And part of the thing that we sing in that, no friend like him is so high and holy, yet no friend is so meek and lowly. When this verse is telling us to associate with the lowly, do you know who the most lowly is? Is Jesus himself. And if I'm the kind of person that's constantly impressed with things that people esteem, guess who I would never have been impressed with? Jesus. Isaiah 53, verses 2 and 3, he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men. My path to humility is associating with lowly things, not always thinking that I need luxury things, associating with lowly people, and ultimately associating with Jesus. The more time I spend with Jesus, looking at the Gospels, looking at people who embody Jesus, the only thing that that's going to do in me, if I have a humble heart, or if I have a receptive heart, is create somebody who's more and more humble, less and less haughty, and less wise in their own estimation. Are you doing those things? We're about to sing this song, "Do You Know My Jesus?" One of the ways that you can know if you know this Jesus is if you're not haughty and you're not wise in your own estimation. If there's anything that we can do for you this morning, this is an opportunity to get your life right with God, for you to begin associating with Christ. Don't leave here without talking to somebody, or the opportunity to come forward while we stand and sing is here for you right now.